The following podcast is an exclusive presentation of Project Entertainment Network.
Hey folks, Brian Keene here. You know, summer's over. We're entering the fall and then the winter. Halloween's coming up, Thanksgiving, and then, of course, the holiday shopping season. Speaking of the holiday shopping season, let me tell you about subculturecorsets.com. They've got everything you need for everyone on your list for this holiday season. Clothing, accessories, gifts, books, you name it, they've got it. They sponsor every show on the Project Entertainment Network, including this one. So please give them your business. Visit subculturecorsets.com.
Three Guys with Beards, the Project Entertainment Network store, featuring t-shirts, mugs, stickers, hoodies and more from your favorite Project Entertainment Network podcasts.
Ink Stain Scribbler's Rest.
The Horror Show with Brian Keene. Why not show your loyalty by wearing a cool product from the podcast group and show off to your friends?
It Cooks.
Armcast.
The Mondo Method Monster Attack.
Necrocastic. Go to projectentertainmentnetwork.com and click on the store tab for more details.
The Liars Club Podcast. Bizarre.
The Lunch Ladies Book Club.
Matters of Faith.
The Project Entertainment Network store, stacked with stuff from the best podcasts on the internet. The Curtain Jerkers.
Buttercup of Doom.
www.projectentertainmentnetwork.com.
There shall come a podcast like no other. Defenders Dialogue with Brian Keene and Christopher Golden. Marvel Comics' original superhero non-team convenes once again. The Incredible Hulk, the Savage Submariner, the Master of the Mystic Arts, Doctor Strange, and a dynamic supporting cast of Marvel superheroes battle against evil as the Defenders. Without further ado, true believers, here's your hosts, Brian Keene and Christopher Golden. Excelsior!
Okay, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Defenders Dialogue, our origin story, perhaps as it were, our first issue. I am Brian Keene.
And I am Christopher Golden.
How you doing, buddy?
Oh, dude, how could I be any better than spending time chatting with you about The Defenders, the best, worst comic book of all time?
That's right. And just a reminder to folks, in case you didn't catch our little 0 episode preview, this show, you know, Chris and I, we've both been in this business 20 years. We've written best-selling novels. We've written comic books. We've had stuff adapted into other mediums, and we've written for other media properties. This podcast is about none of that. This is for us. We may have 3 listeners. Apparently, Victor Laval is our first and only listener.
Yeah,
Shout out to you, Victor.
Listener. Correct.
But,
well, that's what. As I said when I initially posted about it, before we even announced what it was, I said it's the most self-indulgent piece of fanboy nonsense that anyone will ever encounter. But honestly, the thing is, Brian, and I know you even more than I say the best, worst comic book series of all time, but I genuinely love this comic book series. And I have friends, Tom Snigoski, for one, who hate the Defenders. With some, I don't understand why. I think it's because Jack Kirby never drew it. But I love this comic, for all of its weirdness. So all the stuff that makes people go, wait, what? That's the stuff I love.
Well, not just its weirdness. I always tell people, I discovered the Defenders when I was 6 years old, 1976. Or no, I guess I was 8 years old. I was a kid. And it was during Steve Gerber's run on the book. And I learned about, the women's rights movement and race relations and, different political beliefs, socialism, communism, fascism, capitalism, all from a superhero comic. That was really heady stuff for 8-year-old Brian. I love it. And I would say to Tom and anybody else who says, that Jack Kirby never drew it, they need to look at Keith Giffen's run on the book, because I think that's some of his, Keith, good friend of mine, obviously Kirby was a big influence on him, and I think some of his most Kirby-inspired pencils were during his run on the Defenders.
Yeah. No, I mean, I I don't know what it is, honestly. We should talk. I mean, again, granted, it is all the stuff you talked about was such a vital part of Marvel Comics in the 70s and an important influence. You know, I did an essay for a book Lisa Mignona edited called Last Night a Superhero Saved My Life, which is all about how, you know, after my parents separated and then divorced, I sort of learned my sense of right and wrong from Marvel Comics, you know, and so that's a big deal, you know, that stuff you're talking about. But it is also, for me, they were great fun. It was constantly changing. The lineup, the fact that it was the non-team and it changed literally all the time, and everybody who was a second and third tier character got their time in the Defenders, sometimes like 12th tier. Including characters other people have never heard of, like Cloud. But it's Hellcat. It's like, you know, Moon Knight showing up for X number of issues. It's you know, the six-fingered hand and all that stuff, which we'll get to. But it is the familiar thing. Like when I think about the Defenders, and I know we have specific issues to talk about, but one of the things that pops into my mind is Doctor Strange's living room with them all sort of standing around or sitting around, and there's one thing where there's Hulk is like sitting on the floor like a big kid playing with an action figure.
Playing with the action figures. And then Wizard Man say to Smiley Face Man, hello, want to come to my house and sing songs?
Exactly.
That's the exact line of dialogue.
Exactly. And it's Bird Nose and Sword Girl and all of that stuff. And it's like, I was never somebody who could read the Hulk comic on an ongoing basis, I think because it felt so divorced from tangible humanity in a weird way. And I know, like, you know, it is the sort of wandering sadness of the Hulk, but it was this interaction with these other familial characters.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, the Hulk book, now don't get me wrong, I loved the Hulk when I was a kid, and loved it up through into adulthood past Peter David's classic run on the book. But the Hulk's series, he was always a loner. It was always the Hulk versus the world who misunderstands him and want to destroy him. His characterization was much stronger in the pages of the Defenders. These were people who genuinely cared about him. Not at first, which we're going to cover later in this show, but as the series progressed, this was the only family he had. And, you know, he even had a pet deer for a few issues. I don't know if you remember that.
Wait,
you know, they let him have a pet.
I thought you said a pet beer.
No, a pet deer.
I don't remember that.
Well, they did get him drunk, too.
Yes.
I think J.M. DeMatteis.
No, but yeah, he had that deer. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, he had a little baby fawn that he adopted, and they let him raise it. It's just the Hulk, especially for me, has always been the heart of this book. And then when he left, I think Gargoyle kind of filled that role, but we'll get to that in later episodes. But yeah, I guess we should tell folks what we're going to do. If you want to read along at home, today we're starting with Submariner issues 34 and 35 and Marvel Feature issues 1 through 3. Now, these are readily available. They are collected in Marvel Masterworks, The Defenders, the first volume of The Defenders. They are collected in the first volume of Marvel Essential, The Defenders. And I believe they're also available on Marvel Unlimited if you're reading digitally.
Yeah, I think so. We'd have to check. And I suspect also that the 2 Submariner issues are also available in the Submariner Masterworks.
Exactly.
But yeah, it's interesting. So I guess we should talk about that. I mean, I guess we should introduce by saying, and people are going to hear me flipping pages to refresh my memory. One of the best things, actually, Brian, about these Masterworks books is the introductions. The intro in this one is by Roy Thomas, who wrote most of the issues. Well, at least the ones we're talking about today, he wrote all of.
Exactly.
You know, Roy is really interesting because when he I loved his introduction to the book, in which he talks about the fact that, Stan Lee at the time really still was Marvel Comics. And Roy had come in to basically become Stan Jr. And to write and edit basically everything Stan didn't have time for.
Right.
But that also meant that he had to persuade Stan to let him do certain things, including Stan having been the only person prior to this to have written the Silver Surfer. So when he had this idea to do these 2 issues of Submariner that would bring in these 3 loner characters, the Silver Surfer, the Hulk, and Namor. And the interesting thing, to me is that they're all, well, not the Hulk, but, Namor and Silver Surfer are both assholes of a different stripe, right? Well, no, they are, but
no, this is why I love you, man. The notes I took and printed out to talk about, I have here in all caps, Namor and Surfer are both assholes.
Well, yeah, so... and the other thing is, but the one thing I will say, so the setup, do you want to do the setup for the Submariner story?
Well, yeah, and it's worth pointing out before we do that, technically this is not the first appearance of the Defenders. Roy Thomas had actually done a 3-part crossover in Doctor Strange 183, Submariner 22, and The Incredible Hulk 126. Now, in that one, he teamed up Doctor Strange with Submariner and Hulk to protect the Earth from an invasion by these straight up H.P. Lovecraft style beings called the Undying Ones. It's important to point that out because Barbara Norris, who later becomes the Valkyrie, who is just such an important part of the Defenders, that's her first appearance. Now, for some reason, Marvel chose not to collect those. I don't know why. I don't know why Marvel does a lot of the things they do.
Yeah, I thought it was weird that they weren't in here.
I did too, especially since, as we'll find out on next week's show, the early Defender stories all tie back into those.
Right.
But yeah, the next appearance then is Submariner 34 and 35. Now, basically what happens is Namor, that's the Submariner. He enlists the Silver Surfer and the Hulk to help him stop a potentially devastating weather control experiment. Basically, it starts with Hulk landing on this small island nation in the Caribbean named San Pablo. And he ends up fighting these troops of this military dictator. Meanwhile, Submariner is worried about another island in the Caribbean where humans are building this experimental weather manipulation device, sort of a Bronze Age comics version of HARP. Yeah. There's a shout out to you, Jim Cobb. Jim Cobb's probably the only listener that knows what I'm talking about when I say HARP, because he's a conspiracy nut like me. But then the Surfer just sort of shows up, and Namor goes to ask him for help. Now, Chris, you know what? In every early 70s Marvel comic, when 2 characters meet for the first time, what happens?
They beat the shit out of each other.
Yeah.
But I have to say here, and this is what I was about to say, I'm talking about them being assholes. Usually it's Namor who's the one who's being the dick, right? He's usually the one who is approached and then starts punching people.
He's very proud.
And but what I loved about this story, this first issue, which is Submariner 34, is that when he goes to try to get the Silver Surfer to help him, the Silver Surfer beats it, starts punching him, and they fight.
Yeah.
And when they go to try to get the Hulk to help him, the Hulk starts punching Submariner. And it's and what I like about that is that, traditionally Submariner is an asshole. And it's fun to have the tables turned. It's like, hey, it's your turn to get the shit kicked out of you. I really, that was fun.
But what struck me is even in these early appearances, yes, Namor is a dick to the Surfer, and the Surfer is a dick to Namor, which surprised me because this, up until this point, it's worth noting, up until this point, the only person to ever write the Surfer was Stan Lee.
Right.
In fact, he was very hesitant to let Roy Thomas use the Surfer in this crossover,
and only agreed to do it because he said, "Okay, I'll let you do this for this 2 issues, but then at the end, the Surfer has to go away."
Right. And I don't know if you know this or not. The original cover for issue number 34, Stan Lee actually went and changed the dialogue in the cover. He had Surfer. Originally, Surfer was saying, "We must crush our enemies," and Stan changed it to "We must stop them," because he felt that was a little too violent for what was basically Marvel's space hippie before Warlock came along.
Yeah. I mean, well, but again, Warlock made Silver Surfer look like a radical.
But yeah, they're being dicks to each other. But then when Hulk joins the fray, they're both just giant dicks to him throughout the next 2 issues.
But especially, and this is the interesting thing to me, right? Is that that's not the Silver Surfer's way. And,
No.
And then what happens, and I don't want to jump ahead too much, but I thought what brings that into really stark relief is that when you get to Marvel feature number 1, which is the first one with Strange and Hulk and Namor, Doctor Strange, who's supposed to be the sort of paternal figure, and later on becomes a sort of paternal figure to Hulk, is so horrible to the Hulk that the Submariner is like, "No, Hulk, dude, it's okay. We can hang out and be chill. Yes, Doctor Strange is." So the Submariner is the protective parent to the abusive Doctor Strange. Oh my God, it's crazy.
Well, I'm looking here as we're talking. I'm looking at Submariner number 35. The very first page. You've got Hulk, Namor, and Silver Surfer. They're all hanging out in the atmosphere on Surfer's surfboard, and Hulk just asks them, "Tell me again. Well, what are the 3 of us doing?" And right away they start being jerks to him. Namor's like, "Think, Hulk, you dumbass." Second page. "Do you comprehend nothing, you gargoyle?" Hulk gets mad that they're teasing him and jumps off the board, and Namor's urging him to come back, and Surfer's like, there's no reasoning with him.
Yeah, there's no reasoning. I've just driven him away by being a total asshole, but there's no reasoning with him. That's I've seen too many relationships like that. I also thought it was interesting that basically this is another one of those things. Submariner 35. It's not enough that the Hulk and the Silver Surfer are in it. They've got to bring in the Avengers.
Right.
And,
what happens? Issue 34 is basically they beat the shit out of each other in true 70s Marvel fashion, and then they end up joining forces and taking down this military despot. Issue 35, they've still got to deal with the weather machine. Now, it turns out that's being built by a United Nations team. So, Surfer, Namor, they're dicks to Hulk, but, eventually they all arrive. And who does the United Nations call in to deal with the situation, Chris?
Of course, the Avengers.
That's right.
One of the things that I found so fascinating, and I was reading it thinking, Brian will love this, is that I think this is the beginning of the real idea in the core of Marvel Comics that the Defenders and these sort of oddball loner characters are the counterculture, and the Avengers are the man.
Absolutely.
Right?
That's it.
So the idea that the Avengers are called in to protect the government installation. I was reading that and thinking, well, of course they were, because they represent the establishment,
right?
And the Defenders are the counterculture. They're the hippies and the street people, and I thought that was very cool.
Well, what else I found really fascinating with issue 35, and I had forgotten this. I've reread all these many times before, but the whole issue, you've got the Avengers and the Defenders fighting each other. And this super dangerous weather machine, which could destroy the world, is sort of forgotten about. It's in the background, It's the MacGuffin to get all these characters in the same spot so they can beat the shit out of each other.
Right.
Who ends up stopping the weather machine and dismantling it? It's not the Defenders, nor is it the Avengers. It turns out it's actually Lady Dorna, who is Submariner's fiance. While all the men are out there beating the shit out of each other, she and her team sneak in and here's the weather machine. Let's shut it down.
Right. Yeah. It's Lady Dorna and the scientists who go in and they're like, yes, let's just shut this off. And then, of course, the American, as it's UN, but really the Americans are like, oh yeah, I guess this would have blown up the world. Which all I can think about, and not in any way to trivialize what's going on in Texas, but all I could think about was the chemical plant that exploded in Texas this morning.
Right.
Because of the flooding, all the wonderful chemicals that are in the air and in the water now down there. And what I was reading about the lab that has the level 4 germ warfare and plague stuff that's down there, that basically we have no idea what's happened because it's on Galveston Island and they haven't heard from them,
and they can't get into them yet.
Yeah, which I know sounds like the and I don't want to go into a lot of politics, but it's it sounds like the beginning of every 70s and 80s horror novel. Right. But segueing back, as I was reading this again and thinking about this is yet another example of it is the MacGuffin, no question, but it's also a reminder of, hey, by the way, you need the Defenders, even though they're a bunch of jerks who punch each other, because you need that counterculture to point out that you're doing shit wrong. It's
absolutely.
Yeah, I think so. Again, here we are finding. Look, I think that the best thing about Marvel Comics in the 1970s was that you could always read them on more than one level.
Right.
And so I think I know we're not going to spend a ton of time digging deep on this stuff, but it really is interesting because you had this comic that on its surface is really silly. But there is more to it. So it's really fun.
Well, yeah, it's very telling that something from the 70s, you and I both turned 50 this year.
Yep.
I don't know if you wanted that out there on the air or not.
Oh, yeah, it's all good. Proudly 50.
And something from our childhood, yes, the writing is of its time. But it still resonates with things that we have going on today. And I think that's Marvel at its best. Right. Is, these stories, yeah, they may seem dated, they may seem of their time, but in another way, many of these stories are timeless.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's, I think that's true. And you're right. I mean, the dialogue, in a lot of cases is silly, but, you're reading it. I'd be curious to know what, a 15-year-old would think. But I don't know. I think it's cool. Well, let's move on to Marvel Feature. I think.
Well, yeah. You said that we needed the Defenders. We needed the counterculture. Well, a lot of readers felt the same way. Sales for those two issues were much higher than normal for Submariner. So Stan Lee told Roy Thomas, he basically said, you know what? Good job, kid. That was a good idea. Give those characters their own regular ongoing series. But you still can't use Silver Surfer.
Right.
So what Roy Thomas did, he went back to that issue of Doctor Strange, that crossover with Doctor Strange, Submariner, and Hulk that we had mentioned earlier. And he reunited them again for Marvel Feature #1. And I guess I think it was Stan Lee that actually came up with the name The Defenders.
Yeah.
And
he says that. And I think... Yeah. Roy says that Stan came up with the name, I believe, based on or ripping off the at that time recent TV series about a bunch of prosecuting attorneys, or no, excuse me, obviously defense attorneys. What am I saying? So it was a TV drama that he took the name from. But it's apt and it's stuck. I have to say that weirdly in my brain, when I remembered the Defenders before I was starting to reread this, in my mind the Surfer was in it way more early on. But we'll talk about that as we go forward.
Right.
But I do think that Stan telling Roy he couldn't use the Silver Surfer when he launched the Defenders in the Pages of Marvel feature was the best thing that ever happened, because Doctor Strange becomes the core of this thing.
Absolutely.
Immediately.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, one thing I had forgotten about this. Anybody who's a fan of mine has probably heard me wax nostalgically about Sal Buscema. Mm-hmm. He is not one of my favorite comic artists. He's one of my favorite artists of all time. The man basically drew my childhood. Him and Mike Plug, and especially when it comes to the Hulk and the Defenders, because he was on both of those books for so long. Now he had drawn the Submariner stories we just talked about, but for Marvel Feature number 1, he was replaced with Ross Andru, and he was inked by a Golden Age legend and actually the creator of the Submariner, Bill Everett.
Right.
Now, did you read the story in Roy's introduction?
Yes. Yeah. But go ahead. All right. Just suffice to say that Ross Andru's style, according to Roy, was that when he did the pencils, he would do sort of multiple lines to suggest details, musculature, facial structure, things like that, and traditionally let the inker decide which one to actually ink, and that Bill Everett was so irritated by this practice of Ross Andru's that he inked them all.
Right.
So consequently, the first issue of Marvel Feature Presents the Defenders looks like crap.
It's one of the worst illustrated comics. And it's not even the illustrations; it's the inking job,
right?
Which Everett did on purpose. Roy Thomas says in his Marvel Masterworks introduction, he says, "quote to say that Stan Lee was unhappy when he saw Bill's inking of Marvel Feature number 1 would be an understatement. He was livid." End quote.
Right. Yeah.
You go through and look at the art. It's like, what the fuck?
It's
like,
definitely
like a character's frowning, and they've got six creases on their face.
Yeah,
frowning.
It's definitely interesting. Even if you look at the second page, and I know people are not like really looking at this, if anybody's even listening to this, but there's an illustration of Doctor Strange on the bottom left of the second page, and there's so much ink on the picture of his face. It looks like he's got something growing. It looks like he's got a fungus growing on his face.
He does. He looks like David Bowie during full Ziggy Stardust mode.
Exactly. Exactly. No, it's great.
Yeah, the bad guy for this issue is, of course, Yandroth, who would become a regular Defenders villain. He's very much a product of his time, but I have fond memories. Doctor Strange is, of course, Earth's Sorcerer Supreme. Yandroth wanted to be the Scientist Supreme. And basically, the book begins, Doctor Strange gets this telepathic summons from Yandroth. It turns out the villain is lying in the hospital. He's been hit by a truck. And he's dying.
And he's come up with, hit by a truck, dying, he's come up with the greatest fuck you of all time. And the stupidest. I mean, this is the stupidest mad scientist plan of all time. So if I'm gonna die, this is a Trumpian solution. If I'm gonna die, I am so important that if I'm gonna die, I'm gonna take the entire world with me. Not because the world killed me, but just because if I can't live, no one else should be able to live either. And
Right.
so he's constructed this artificially intelligent computer system called what is it? Omegatron.
Omegatron. And it has his face.
Yes, it has his face. And at the moment that Yandroth dies, Omegatron will speak his name, Yandroth's name, and the entire nuclear arsenal of Earth will simultaneously explode.
Yep, every nuclear stockpile on Earth is going to blow up.
And again, like, the best thing about this plan is that unlike almost every other supervillain plan in the history of comics, it's not for gain, it's just to be a dick.
Yeah, he was an early nihilist. So, of course, Doctor Strange, he's got to find help in dismantling this machine. So he recruits Namor, the Submariner, and they don't fight. Unlike every other 70s Marvel comic, they don't fight each other. Namor agrees to help them. And then they go to help the Hulk. And you're right. This Doctor Strange is just needlessly cruel here.
He constantly, he's such a jerk to the Hulk. Again, we'll remind people that later on he does become a sort of paternal figure to the Hulk. But he is such an ass to the Hulk.
Yeah. Hulk is wandering through the woods, minding his own business, and Doctor Strange is in his, he's astrally projecting. And Hulk's like, who's there? Someone is watching Hulk. Hulk can feel it. And, Doctor Strange says, if only I can summon up enough power to, ha! And so it begins. Now, what happened there visually? Doctor Strange trips Hulk. He basically pushes him over. And what's very telling is the ha! And so it begins.
Right.
It's not, I regret doing that. Oh, it's a shame to trick this huge creature. It's ha! And so it begins.
Yeah.
And he leads him on this cat and mouse chase, just taunting him cruelly and needlessly.
It is. I feel almost guilty about how much we enjoy this, but then again, it is a comic book, so.
Yeah. So they eventually break into Yandroth's compound, and the machine is about to speak its name, and what does Doctor Strange do?
Well, again, he finds a solution, but again, one of the things I love about comics, especially in those days, is it's a temporary solution which he promptly forgets that was temporary, which is he freezes the machine in time so that its countdown is frozen.
Right.
So he hasn't stopped the machine from, exploding the entire world's arsenal and killing, destroying the entire planet. He's only paused it. He's pressed pause, and then promptly forgets that at some point it might unpause.
Yeah, it's 5 seconds. There's 5 seconds left in the countdown. Now remember, when the countdown reaches 0, every nuclear weapon on Earth is going to simultaneously explode.
Yeah.
So he pauses it at 5 seconds, and then he
leaves.
Yeah, he says, thus, Earth now has countless years to live. And I think Hulk has the best line. Too confusing for Hulk. Yeah. Hulk will go now. Someplace he can be alone.
Oh, God. Well, all right. So then Marvel feature number 2 was really exciting when I reread this, Brian, because honestly, I didn't remember that all of this great stuff was set up so early.
Oh, yeah.
So, and this apparently is the second time that Roy introduced, and I guess it was in that initial storyline that you talked about that was the crossover with Doctor Strange, Hulk and Submariner. But he introduced the not fictional, the real-life town of Rutland, Vermont.
Yep.
And its annual Halloween festival, and had introduced the idea that, of course, there was all kinds of real supernatural stuff and witchcraft and everything going on up there. And these stories were picked up later by other writers of the series and other places in the Marvel universe at the time.
Not just Marvel, multiple comic universes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, what it was, the organizer of the parade was a super fan named Tom Fagan, and what he used to do every year, he would invite comic book creators to the parade. Now, keep in mind, this is the '60s. This is even before the '70s. This is the '60s. Okay, cosplay is reserved for Halloween night. But he would have the Marvel bullpen and folks from DC Comics and, Gold Key, Charlton. They'd come to the parade and dress as comic book characters. And very early in this parade's history, you have all these people dressed as, Doctor Strange and Hulk and Iron Man and Captain America. Marvel, Roy Thomas had worked it into the plot line. The parade first appears in Avengers issue number 83. And the parade organizer, Tom Fagan, is actually a character.
Right.
Roy also wrote himself and his wife, Jeannie.
Right, and they all appear in this issue, too.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, the parade and Tom, it went on Batman issue 237, The Mighty Thor 206, Justice League, Amazing Adventures.
That's awesome.
Another, more issues of Thor and Avengers. Dr. Spectre. You remember Dr. Spectre?
I do, yeah.
Freedom Fighters, Ghosts, Thunder Bunny, Animal Man, Generation X, Superboy. I guess the last time it was really used was probably 1997. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think it's been used since then. But yeah, this is like the ultimate in-joke of in-jokes.
But think about that. You're talking about the ultimate in-joke of in-jokes that has gone on or went on for 25 years. If 97 was the last time it happened.
Right.
And it's really interesting. I mean, I think that if they were ever going to do another Marvel DC crossover, that should be it.
I agree.
But I think, but the other thing we should say before we go on talking about the plot is that it immediately you see the difference in the art. I mean, the art starting with page 1 is gorgeous.
Yes.
It's also really interesting to me that even though we begin with a witch's sabbat basically, it's Dormammu that they're praying to, and they're summoning Dormammu, the classic Doctor Strange villain, seen at the end of the recent Doctor Strange film, into Rutland. Right. So it's fascinating. So we had Ross Andrew again as on the art, and your buddy Sal Buscema as inker.
Yes, and what a difference! Even when he wasn't drawing, even when he was just inking, what a difference Sal made. Because again, it's the same artist as the first issue, but night and day difference in how it looks.
Right.
And that comes down to Sal, inking and making Ross Andrew look good.
I should say also here too, Brian, that I'm sorry to cut you off. Just going to say that. These masterworks are not cheap, no question. And this is not a commercial for Marvel Masterworks, but man, the difference in the reading experience when you have the richness of color that's available on this paper versus the original comics, it's a completely different reading experience. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
No, I agree. I sold my entire comic collection years and years ago to buy a house. It basically served as the down payment for my house at the time.
Right.
And it was just when everything was starting to get the archival treatment. Like I had not a complete run of the Spirit, but I had a good run. Selling them was made easier by the fact that I could turn around and buy those Spirit archives that Dark Horse produced. The one thing I kept was my run of the Defenders.
Right.
And even still, I've broken down and bought these Marvel Masterworks volumes simply because it does look so much more vibrant.
Yeah.
On this paper. So, you want to talk a little bit about the plot for number 2?
Yeah, I mean, look, the plot for me, the plot is mostly interesting because of the Rutland setting, the sort of witchery going on, the presence of Dormammu, and the fact that what essentially happens is that they, in order to serve Dormammu, and correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but essentially what they're trying to do is they're trying to use Doctor Strange's body. His astral form is gone, but basically, they're going to have Dormammu enter the world by inhabiting Doctor Strange's body.
Right, exactly.
Which seems like a terrible plan. And then what's interesting to me is that Submariner and the Hulk go to Rutland essentially to rescue Doctor Strange, which is the first instance, I think, of there being any kind of real ties, like real bond between them.
Right.
That they feel this sort of, that they feel this need, and they go there separately. I do love, by the way, there's a point at which they disguise themselves, including Wong and Clea, disguise themselves, and nobody can recognize the Submariner, even though his pointy ears are very prominently displayed because he's wearing a hat. The Submariner is not in his skimpy, bathing suit and is wearing a hat, and therefore, the police don't recognize. Or they don't recognize him, and then the wind blows off his hat, and all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, it's the Submariner."
Something else you mentioned, Clea and Wong. Now, for folks who saw the Doctor Strange movie, you know, of course, who Wong is. They were supporting characters in Doctor Strange's book. They were basically, Alfred, the Alfred to Batman.
Right.
But they were just that. They were supporting characters. Later on in the Defenders, the two of them, especially Clea, become such prominent characters on their own. And you see your first glimpse of that in Marvel Feature 2. There's a whole segment with Wong fighting the cultists, and he gets knocked out, and then, Clea wakes him up, and, it's the two of them that end up drawing Hulk and Submariner to the rescue. This was kind of unheard of back then. You didn't see the supporting characters getting roles like that. The Pages of Spider-Man, which Stan Lee was still writing at the time. Every issue, you'd have one page where Peter would go to college, or he'd come back to his apartment, and there's Harry and Flash and Liz and whoever, and they'd say their lines, and that's it for the book. So, as an adult rereading this, it was interesting to me to see that groundwork being laid there.
Yeah. No, I think it is, and it also was representative of a change that was happening in these comics. And, Claremont was doing a lot at the time in the Pages of X-Men. I was sorry, hold on a second. It was with introducing these supporting characters, and having them really have roles, but this is, I think, part of the again, the familial element of some of these books, where at the time, Spider-Man was a story about Spider-Man, and even if you read the Avengers in this era, there was sort of a familial element, but they really were more like coworkers,
right?
Whereas when you read stuff like Doctor Strange with Clea and Wong at that point, and the Defenders, and X-Men at that time, X-Men had a bunch of heroes, but they also had these, I'm trying to remember the names. There was people who worked at Xavier's estate at the school.
Well, and there were like Moria McTaggart. And
Yeah. But there were also a couple of other, characters. I think I can't remember now who they were, but in any case, like like the in the FF Wyatt Wingfoot. You know what I mean? You had these things happening, so it did become more of like what we would recognize as television drama, right?
Right.
So interesting stuff. I also just want to point out for those of you who who are reading this that before we move on to Marvel feature number 3, there's a moment at which the astral form of Doctor Strange becomes a giant astral form of Doctor Strange fighting a giant astral form of Dormammu on a mountaintop or floating above a mountaintop. And if you read the story for nothing else, you could read it for that, because it's that kind of stuff that that's what you want. That's a Defenders moment,
Exactly. And then, we talk about the weirdness of this book and how it would switch from something very serious to something comical. It just, bizarreness with each and every issue. You transition from that battle between Dormammu and Strange to Marvel feature number 3, which is basically any parent out there of a certain age probably remembers and loathes Barney the Dinosaur and the Teletubbies. Marvel feature number 3 is for you, because the premise is, what if Barney the Dinosaur was an alien here to eat your children?
Yeah. If only, in some ways. We should say that the character who is the villain, Zemnu the Titan, right, was an earlier monster from the early days, the Atlas Comics days, I think,
right,
at the time, called the Hulk.
That's right.
And Roy Thomas thought it would be fun for people who had read those comics and would recognize him to bring in the now renamed Zemnu the Titan and have the Hulk fight the former Hulk. And it is really entertaining. And it is funny and subversive as hell. I love the scenes where... So for those of you, Zemnu the Titan is essentially the Barney the Dinosaur character. He's got a children's show. He's the sidekick to this human character. And there's a scene where Zemnu the Titan is supposed to get a pie in the face, but ducks, and it hits his human partner on the show in the face. If there is a sillier moment, it's just like, and this is what this issue is about. There are little toys every kid has, and so when you're out of the room, parents, he's looking at the TV screen. Actually, Brian, it reminds me of Halloween 3: Season of the Witch.
Very much so.
Yep.
Very much so.
So who thought we'd be talking about that movie today? But yeah, it is this basically preparing the children to be taken away and eaten by aliens through this TV show and mesmerizing them until our heroes get involved.
Right. And reading so much of Marvel at that time, I don't recall anything more bizarro than this, plotline wise. I mean, in any of the other books that were coming out at that time. And because so much of the Defenders from here on out just gets weird,
right?
I think this is a really crucial issue in the chronology.
It is tonally, right? I mean, you're setting a tone that says, think of the weirdest thing you could do that would be silly if you didn't play it straight, and then play it straight. And that will be the Defenders.
Exactly. So, there's not much else to say about it other than, I mean, it's a perfect one and done comic, which, younger listeners, you're probably not familiar with the concept of a one and done comic. That's where a story begins and ends in the same issue. That nobody was writing for the trade paperback back then.
Right.
And it's just it's the perfect little one and done comic. What I found interesting, not only did we now have Doctor Strange's supporting cast appearing in the book, but now Hulk's supporting cast appears as well. Jim, who was his sidekick in the 70s, because at that point Rick Jones was Rick Jones with Captain America or Captain Marvel at that point?
I'm not sure. Yeah, one or the other. Rick Jones was definitely not a one hero man.
Right. But so yeah, it's for me, it's of the ones we've reviewed today, it's definitely my favorite. It's one that if somebody says, explain the Defenders to me. Why do you love that comic so much? That's the early issue I would probably hand them.
Well, that's it. See, for me, it's Marvel feature number 2 because of the Rutland, Vermont stuff and all the sort of supernatural elements. But yeah, this one has its tongue firmly in cheek, but again plays it straight, and I love that. And that's, you're right. I mean, it sets up so much. The other thing I want to say, to finish it off, is the very end. We have the Hulk and the Submariner are pissed off because the soldiers try to stop them or capture them as usual, and Submariner says, "Come, brutish one, our business here is finished, and let not even Doctor Strange summon us in Earth's next hour of need, for we will not come." Which leads, of course, directly into the Defenders number 1.
Yeah. Guess what? They came again.
Yeah, exactly.
So we'll talk about that next week. We'll be covering, if you're reading along at home, Victor, and if there's anybody else listening.
Victor and any other person who might be listening.
Yeah, we'll be covering Defenders issues number 1 through 6.
Right.
And there's lots of good stuff in there. Valkyrie, of course, we're going to have to spend some time talking about her. I think one of the most important female characters in comics, certainly from the Bronze Age, and yet one that I don't think it's nearly enough credit or notice, and I think she's sadly underused today.
Right, yeah. Very sadly underused and really vital. I think because so many people think about the Defenders as a lesser title, they don't appreciate what Valkyrie meant. I was rereading those issues, which we'll talk about next week, but yeah, really, really interesting to reread them and to see how the character was handled, and because she was specifically made to be quote unquote liberated.
Right, and we'll also that'll tie into more discussion of why Doctor Strange is a dick, because if you think his treatment of the Hulk and his solution to stopping Yandroth's machine were dickish moves, wait do you see in what he did to Valkyrie after their initial first meeting.
Yep.
So, all right. You got anything else you want to say before I close this out, man?
Just that it was a lot of fun, and I look forward to doing it again next week.
Absolutely, man. After the day I've had, I needed this. I needed some geek time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you needed some geek time with us, Defenders Dialogue is available on iTunes, Android, iHeartRadio, Roku, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and all other platforms via the Project Entertainment Network. Check them out. You might like some of their other shows. For example, our engineer is the one and only Tommy Clark, and Tommy has his very own podcast, The Necrocasticon, which is also available right here on the Project Entertainment Network. If you'd like to advertise on this show, send me an email, briankeene@live.com, and just say, hey, I'd like to advertise on Defenders Dialogue, and Chris and I will hook you up. I will say rates for this show are going to be remarkably cheaper than our own individual podcasts.
Now, why do you say that?
Well, because A, it's a new show, so you and I don't have any listener numbers to show to advertisers, and B, it's the two of us yammering about comic books that are nearly 50 years old at this point.
It's the world's greatest podcast. That's what I say.
That's right. It's trying to think of how to tie it in with the non-team logo for the Defenders. I'll have to work on that.
That's right.
Yeah. Anyway, folks, we'll see you back here next week for Defenders issues number 1 through 6.
Hello, is anybody out there? Anybody. This is Jim Cobb. If you are hearing this, the worst has happened. I've recorded a podcast at the end of the world and will broadcast it on channel PEN every Friday. It's all about the apocalypse, books, movies, TV, how much food and water will you need in your bunker, all that kind of stuff.
Excuse me, sir. You're going to have to keep the noise down. You're in a library, and you're scaring the kids. The world hasn't ended yet.
Sorry, ma'am.
Shh. You're in the library at the end of the world with host Jim Cobb.
Fridays, exclusively on Project Entertainment Network.
This has been an exclusive presentation of the Project Entertainment Network.